Good afternoon. I hope you're all doing very well. My name is Aniket Shah, and I'm the Global Head of ESG Strategy at Jefferies, the investment bank. I want to first start by thanking the organizers of today's conference to focus on emerging markets and ESG, emerging markets and sustainable development, because this intersection does not get nearly enough focus in the capital markets. It doesn't get nearly enough focus from academia, and as a result, we're in a pretty dark place with regards to how the emerging economies, a term which frankly has outlived its usefulness, will be able to evolve over the next 50 years and also contribute positively to the needs of sustainability. I have one very clear and very simple message for all of you, which is that emerging markets will be the home of experimentation, and experimentation that is required for the world to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda. Okay? That experimentation will come from emerging markets and not from developed markets for one simple reason, which is necessity. For a fate of history, a fate of geography, we have emerging economies today that cumulatively have contributed less than 20% of global CO2 emissions, but are the most vulnerable to climate change. 9 out of 10 of the world's most vulnerable economies today to climate are in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. The economic damages to Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia as a result of climate change will be significantly worse as a percentage of GDP than it will be for the high-income world. And that necessity to basically adapt to a warming world, but also continue to grow and evolve and develop, will mean that great innovation and great learnings will come from emerging markets. And I want to just focus very quickly on 5 topics that we in the investment community should focus on. The first is the rollout and investment in renewable energy. We often forget that China has invested more in renewable energy over the last 10 years than the next 3 countries put together. We often forget that countries like India are leading in many ways the rollout of solar. We forget, for example, that Egypt has expanded the pace of renewable energy deployment by 50% in recent years. These are numbers you don't see in developed markets. And there are lessons here for all countries to learn around the pace and the scale and the abilities of transition. The second area of experimentation is partnership between high-income countries and low-income countries. Prime Minister Modi at Glasgow came out and said, yes, India is going to try to get to net zero by the second half of the century. But he also said that that will only happen if there's $1 trillion a year in climate finance made available just to India per annum for the next 48 years. Okay? $1 trillion per annum. And the rich world has not been able to get even $100 billion of climate finance, which was promised 12 years ago, so far. If we don't figure out a clearer pact between high-income and low-income countries, this whole transition will not work. It is abundantly clear, and it's our job here as the investor community and as people of influence to say to governments in the high-income world, this partnership does need to happen. You're seeing examples of this today. You're seeing the project in South Africa, the phase down of coal, for example, that give us early models of how high-income and low-income countries can support a clean transition. But without that kind of partnership, this whole transition will not work. The third area that I want to focus on is around new approaches to economic progress and to the measurement of economic progress. One of the most interesting developments over the last few weeks has been the IPCC's Working Group 3 report on climate change mitigation. And I'll forgive you if you didn't have the time to read the several thousand pages in that document, but it was explicitly clear in that report that one of the ways that we will wean ourselves off of fossil fuels will be through a different metric to analyze human well-being compared to the GDP. And coming out of emerging markets over the last 40 years, there have been many such contributions. I think about the Human Development Indicator, the HDI, created by Professor Amartya Sen and Professor Al-Haq in the 80s. I think about the gross national happiness concept coming out of the country of Bhutan. I think about the GEP that is being discussed in China and used to look at ecosystem and environmental impacts alongside GDP. So there is a real need to expand the way that we think about well-being. And if you ask me, the clearest and best thinking around these issues is coming from emerging markets, and we should support that and learn from it. The fourth area is low-cost sustainability innovation. The simple reality is that emerging markets, like India, like Egypt, like Vietnam, will have to develop on a low-carbon pathway. And that's going to require new ways of doing things. It's going to require new policy frameworks, new technologies, new build-out of grids in real quick time. It's going to require a deployment of things like carbon capture and hydrogen, and, by the way, negative emissions technologies. We highlighted recently in a note that today, almost half of all three-wheelers sold in India are electric vehicles, a scale that we could not have even anticipated 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So we at Jefferies are looking very clearly at some of these low-cost, low-carbon innovations that are coming out of emerging markets. And the fifth area that I think all of us need to focus on is climate change adaptation. Climate change adaptation was considered in climate circles effectively taboo discussion for decades. Okay, because the focus was, let's start by mitigation, let's go and try to solve the underlying problem, and then we can talk about how to adapt. Well, I'm sorry, folks, the time has run out, and India today and Pakistan are struggling from heat waves that were not even expected for the next 30, 40, 50 years. Wet bulb temperature limits are being passed, putting human survivability truly in question in certain geographies. We are seeing adaptation happening in South Asia, early warning systems. We are seeing adaptation happening in the agricultural sector with new forms of seeds that are resilient to heat. We are seeing adaptation, of course, in the way that people are coming together to help in times like this. And that is an area that we think needs a lot more focus from the investment community and from the financial community. At Jefferies, we're actively involved on all of these topics because we think emerging markets will be the great experimenters of the next 30 to 40 years, again, out of necessity, out of an unfortunate fate of history and an unfortunate fate of geography, a set of countries that have contributed very little to climate change that are going to bear the brunt of it, and we in the investment community need to spend more time understanding it and supporting it. I'll end with one final thought. One of the simplest and easiest ways to get more capital to flow from high-income to low-income countries is through the multilateral development finance system and through the multilateral development banking system. There are literally trillions of dollars of capital that can be raised and deployed now with a little bit more focus around how these MDBs operate, their leverage ratios, and I know for a fact capital markets participants will be buying those bonds if they come to market. And that's one specific area I think we should all focus on. Again, I want to thank the organizers for focusing on this important topic. Let today be the beginning of a new chapter of ESG discussions that puts emerging markets right at the center. Thank you all very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.